afternoon. I think, we are here for a treat. We are honored to have all of you with us. And as we are starting our presentation this afternoon, it is really an honor for us to welcome you to one of our webinar. The Louverture Cultural Society welcomes all of you to this. Today is Fête du Drapeau, is a Haitian Flag Day. We are celebrating this wonderful event, and we are gonna have a very rewarding experience tonight because we're going to celebrate the women who have participated in our wonderful history. But today being Flag Day, we want to acknowledge that drapeau nous, c'est fierté nous. And I welcome all everyone, and in a minute, we're gonna share with you the agenda. What we want to actually ask if you're not talking, we would love for you to be staying on mute. When you have a chance to talk, you would have to raise your hand, put your reaction button, and raise your hand. Actually, we will be sharing with you in the agenda for tonight. We have a very full agenda, and besides telling you welcome, we want to introduce a very special guest, our guest speaker tonight. We will introduce her in a minute, and she will be talking to us about the roles of women in Haiti's struggle for freedom and independence. We will have an opportunity to answer questions at some point, but we don't want you to be shy of asking questions. We welcome you actually putting them in the chat. We will be taking all of them and making sure that Dr. Edens, address as many as she can. And finally, we will have our closing remarks. So with no further ado, I know I wanted to acknowledge all of you and say again, thank you for being with us tonight. So as we are moving, today, as I said, we want to be talking with Dr. Edens. Actually, is going to entertain the subject, the topic with us. But we know that there is, while there is no documented in a coherent manner about women participation in the freedom struggle, snippets of information have revealed that they were both directly and indirectly involved in that battle against slavery. So Dr. Edens will review with us and discuss the many roles that the women have taken. So this is why we're having this webinar. And with no further ado, I would like to take a minute to actually introduce to you our guest. Our guest speaker. And, I am going to do that. Dr. Edens, I know you're here and I know you are eager to talk to us about about this subject matter. So what I'm going to do, if that's okay, as I am letting people know a little about you, I'm going to actually stop my share and give you the opportunity to put your presentation on the screen for us. But as you do that, I am going to myself go ahead and give and share the wonderful thing that you actually have done. So I am going to stop sharing and you can go for now and share, but I am going to go ahead and let people know a little bit about you, if that's okay, as you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Crystal Edens holds a dual major PhD in African American and African Studies and Sociology from Michigan State University, and is currently an assistant professor of Africana Studies at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, where she teaches courses on the African diaspora theory, slavery, race, and colonialism, and collective action and social movement. Dr. Eden's research on the African diaspora's consciousness, historical sociology, social movement, and collective action, Marronage, and the Haitian Revolution has appeared in the Journal of Haitian Studies, Gender and History, and the Haitian History Journal. Her work has been supported by the Brown University Ruth G. Simmons Postdoctoral Fellowship and John Carter Brown Library Associate Fellowship and the National Science Foundation Sociology Program Doctoral Dissertation Research Improvement Award. Dr. Edens is currently working on a book manuscript, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora, as a UNC Duke Consortium in Latin America and Caribbean Studies, College Educators Research Fellow. We need to follow her on Twitter because that book is probably coming very soon, right, Dr. Edens? We need to follow her on Twitter at Crystal N. Edens. So this is in a very brief summary of what this knowledgeable woman is willing and able to share with us. So thank you, Dr. Edens, for being with us this afternoon, and the podium is all yours.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you for that warm welcome. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I see some of my friends. I think I see my mom in the chat. Hey, everybody. And thank you so much to the Louverture Cultural Society for inviting me to talk with you about this very important but somewhat elusive topic about women's roles in the Haitian Revolution. So one of the reasons for my fascination with this topic, I believe, started with my own questions about the role of Black women and religion in social change. So as a young African-American woman from a predominantly Black working class community of the south side of Ypsilanti, Michigan, and later as a student at Michigan State University, I came to learn that the lived reality of poor and working class African-Americans was intimately tied to the histories of slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, and the Great Migration. So growing up in a religious household where women like my mom and my grandmother were the pillars of the family, I perceived women as indispensable within Black culture and Black institutions. So I started to look to other parts of the African diaspora for similar histories and stories, and to learn more about how women and religion influence collective efforts for social change and transformation. When I learned about the Haitian Revolution, I was captivated, not only because it was the most successful slave uprising in modern history, and not just because of the military genius and might of male leaders like Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, but rather it was Cécile Fatiman, the Mumbo priestess who led the Bois Cayman ceremony 1 week prior to the August 1791 insurrection, who embodied my curiosities about women, religion, and revolution. At the ceremonial meeting, Fatiman, along with Bukundadi and delegates representing the enslaved masses from plantations across Haiti's northern plain, plotted the demise of the sugar plantation economy and outlined the terms of their liberation. The revolutionaries called upon the spiritual power of West and West Central African deities to empower them to avenge the wrongs of slavery and colonialism and the harsh realities of unrepentant violence and unprecedented death that upheld the plantation system. So today, there is still knowledge and understanding among Haitian people about the centrality and importance of Haitian women in history and in contemporary society. So the image that you're seeing right now is of the Haitian 10 Goud banknote from 2004, the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. This piece of currency prominently features a woman named Sanité Belair. Sanité was executed during the last days of the Leclerc expedition of October 1802, alongside her husband Charles Belair, who was the nephew of Toussaint Louverture. Sanité was known for her fearlessness and refusal to be blindfolded during the execution. I think that this banknote is an example of how women in the Haitian Revolution are remembered today, albeit in ways that might require unique methods of analysis to comprehend. So historians like Bayina Bello draw on oral traditions to elevate women fighters like Tante Toya Montu and Aunt of Dessalines, who may have been a member of the Dahomey Women's Army. So still very few full-length English language doctoral dissertations or books have been written about enslaved women in colonial Haiti, and their actions during the Haitian Revolution have been written. So scholars like Haitian anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Triot, historian Marisa Fuentes, and professor of English Sadia Hartman have turned our attention to the mechanics of how history is written based on the things that historical archives do or do not say. So we have to understand that most of the remaining records about the transatlantic slave trade, enslavement in the Americas, and even enslaved people resistance actions were written by enslavers in account books, slave rosters, runaway slave advertisements, travelers' accounts, and plantation records. These materials upheld the bureaucratic and managerial dimensions of slavery. These records reflect and are deeply embedded in slave owners and slave traders' financial interests in slavery and their racist biases and ways of thinking about Black people. Enslaved people's resistance patterns is also an area where archival documents are often intentionally biased against those who were attempting to free themselves from bondage and oppression. Since most enslaved people did not leave behind records of their own, their intentionality, the ways they understood and navigated the world, and their attempts to free themselves are not fully represented in archival documents. Similarly, women, and especially enslaved Black women, especially were written out of archives, as well as any representation of their full expression of themselves, their modes of being, and their forms of resistance, leaving us few clues as to how they lived their lives. So today I want to spend a little bit of time talking about perspectives that I think can help us fill in the gaps and create a broader picture of what women's experiences and their contributions most likely looked like and during the revolutionary process. Then I'll discuss a few women who are noted in the archival histories of the Haitian Revolution, the various roles that they played, and the ways that we can use this knowledge to better understand and center Haitian women today. African descended women have a very long history of surviving systems that subject them to racial oppression and economic and sexual exploitation. These patterns of marginalization and oppression are rooted in the transatlantic slave trade that forced over 12 million captive Africans to the Americas between the late 15th and late 19th centuries. Haiti was once the most prosperous colony in the Americas, and over the course of the slave trade received nearly 800,000 Africans, approximately 60% of whom were male. Some historians estimate that nearly 1/3 of those newly arrived Africans died within 5 years from starvation, overwork, brutality, or disease. As the 18th century sugar plantation economy boomed, planters increasingly viewed women as the source of physical and reproductive labor to increase crop productivity as well as fertility rates. So it's often repeated and well known that colonial Haiti's conditions were so deadly that the enslaved population could not reproduce itself, leading planters to continually replace dead laborers with new African-born captives. Cedric Robinson has argued that the transatlantic slave trade flattened and erased ethnic, cultural, religious, political, and linguistic distinctions and identities among African captives, reducing them to an expendable labor pool and a source of capital. Similarly, we can also argue that these processes of commodification reduced African women to their enslaved labor and to their reproductive capacities. This flattening of their humanity to workers and reproducers not only failed to acknowledge their cultural identities, but also the robust roles and responsibilities that women held in various pre-colonial African societies as healers, soldiers, queens and queen mothers, religious leaders, agriculturalists, midwives, and so on and so forth. Enslavers sought to use reproduction to advance economic development, meaning the mechanisms of racial capitalism or capitalist development in racial directions were forcibly engendered through Black women's labor, bodies, and reproduction. Women made up nearly half of colonial Haiti's enslaved population. And while free women of color were often economically independent as traders, real estate owners, and at times as slave owners, African-born women especially were the backbone of the slave-based economy, laboring alongside men, cutting and processing sugarcane and working in coffee and indigo plantations. They were expected to work through and shortly after their pregnancies. They were brutally mistreated sexually or otherwise, and especially when they rebelled or even at the whims of plantation owners and managers. Just as racial capitalism is expressed through gender, we might also argue that aspects of the Black radical tradition, the long-term struggle against these systems of oppression, were also expressed in distinctly gendered ways. So I believe there remains opportunity to elevate a gendered analysis to our understanding of Black women's roles in rebellions, social movements, mobilizations, collective actions, and revolutions that span space and time, including the 18th century. So I argue that if we want to begin to understand enslaved women's lifeways prior to, during, and after the Haitian Revolution, we have to interrogate the norms, values, and behaviors and roles that African women embodied in their homelands. By recovering African women's histories, we can piece together their economic, militaristic, political, and religious activities that contributed to the revolutionary events in Haiti. Victims of the transatlantic slave trade did not just forget or abandon their African identities, beliefs, and practices once they disembarked in the Americas. Rather, they reassembled and reformulated what they knew and did in their homelands and translated these ideas and behaviors to a new context. For example, in the Dahomey Kingdom at the Bight of Benin, there was a military body who were referred to by outsiders as the Amazons. From as early as the 17th century, these women soldiers served the king of Dahomey as his personal security and in warfare. Also in the Dahomey Kingdom and other West African societies, women were central politically and religiously, serving as queen mothers who counseled and advised kings and provided spiritual guidance for the kingdom. At the Central African coast, queens like Donna Beatrice and Queen Nzinga not only headed their respective kingdoms, but also led movements to oppose the disruptive social, economic, and political forces connected to the transatlantic slave trade and European domination. Additionally, women in various African societies were central figures such as healers, midwives, and they were indispensable economic producers who performed the agricultural labor that sustained their communities. This African perspective is key when investigating women's roles in the Haitian Revolution as nurses, cultivators, spies, and sacred authorities. There are but a handful of women who appear in the historical archive as revolutionaries, But these figures were probably only but a few of the masses of women who took up arms or otherwise actively struggled for their liberation. In order to fill in the gaps about women's activities, we can look at the ways they translated cultural and religious knowledge and practices into political power to facilitate liberation. The religious system, now known as Haitian Vodou, is based on human relationships to West and West Central African spirits who at times intervene in human affairs at the behest of adherents. Women are central figures in Vodou contemporarily as Mumbo priestesses whose presence is key to spiritual efficacy. Historically, enslaved women used their ritual practices and relationships to spirits to enhance the power of the revolutionary masses. The most well-known example of the intersection of African-based religion and revolution, as I already mentioned, is the Bois Cayman ceremony, the gathering of rebels that occurred only 1 week before the August 1791 uprising. Oral histories and other sources identified Cecile Fatiman as the mambo or the main presider during the ceremony that sacralized the religion. And other Vodou queens like Princess Amethyst accompanied and offered sacred protections to the male rebels. So after August 1791, the uprising spread quickly throughout the colony. And by 1793, the rebels had freed themselves from bondage and formed a formidable army that repelled both Spanish and English forces, prompting French authorities to issue a general emancipation from slavery. Former slaves were then referred to as cultivators, who were to be paid for their work, free from violent punishments, and were free to buy, sell, and consume the items that they produced. Women remained a core component of the agricultural labor force, especially as they were expected to help economically sustain the colony's economy through the height of the revolution. In Southern Haiti in particular, women cultivators entered the archival records as labor protesters who opposed unfair working conditions and unequal pay between them and their male counterparts. And there are also records from the South alluding to women acting as spies, smugglers, nurses for the male rebels. So although women were typically tied to the land and local plantations due to work, surveillance, and family obligations, some women were able to navigate the colony's landscape to secure resources, to connect rebel armies across plantations. Scholars like Carolyn Fick have argued that women often took temporary leave and used their time to traverse plantations and spread the word and organizational plans for the revolt. And since runaway Maroons are of my area of interest, I'll discuss two women, Charlotte Papillon and Magdalene, whose partners were central leaders during the Haitian Revolution, Jean-François Papillon and Hyacinthe Ducoudray. Advertisements for both Charlotte and Magdalene suggest that these women escaped their owners in the months leading up to and after the August 1791 revolt and may have helped to organize the revolution. So first, we see Magdalene, who escaped sometime in the summer of 1790 and was believed to have been accompanying Hyacinthe. Hyacinthe was a ritual leader who in 1792 was at the head of 15,000 rebels in Croix de Bouquet near Port-au-Prince. Another primary source by Colonel Malenfant indicated that women in Hyacinthe's camp commonly ran errands to exchange weapons and food. So we see Magdalene possibly fulfilling this role as a mobilizer before the Haitian Revolution uprisings. And what is also interesting about this advertisement is that it suggests that Magdalene transgressed gender norms by dressing in men's clothes, perhaps not only to disguise herself as a free person, but perhaps to conceal her active participation in helping to organize the uprisings that later occurred in the Western Department. Similarly, Charlotte, a Poulard woman from the Senegambia region, escaped the Papillon plantation in March 1791, 3.5 years after her partner Jean-Francois Papillon made his escape. And we know that Jean-Francois Papillon was one of the major leaders of the revolution in the early days, who eventually negotiated with the Spanish and became a Spanish officer. It was suspected that Charlotte was abusing the temporary pass that she was given and had been moving about in different quarters. By the time this advertisement was posted, it was believed that she was either in or somewhere around Port-au-Prince. So we may never know exactly what Charlotte was doing between March and August of 1791. We may not know the various parishes she visited or with whom she was in contact. However, it may be possible that she left in the spring on behalf of Jean-Francois to help coordinate the rebellions that would begin a few months later. While Charlotte was traveling in the greater Port-au-Prince area, smaller uprisings began there in July that anticipated the August mass revolt in the Northern Plain. By September, Charlotte was back north with Jean-Francois, and rebels at the former Galifet plantation named them king and queen. The election of kings and queens was common among the rebels whenever they gained military control of a parish. And in this case, we might consider that Charlotte's crowning may have even been a reward for her role in helping to coordinate the northern and western revolts. In other cases, partnership, such as what we saw with Magdalene and Charlotte, partnership, marriage, as well as motherhood are lenses through which women become more visible in the histories of the Haitian Revolution. In 1802, when Napoleon Bonaparte's armies sailed to the French Caribbean to reinstate slavery, the formerly enslaved women and men of colonial Haiti, who had become an armed military force proven in combat, continued their resistance for absolute freedom from slavery and independence from colonial rule. Some women were married to political officers, some women who were married to military officers seem to have participated in this struggle. So according to C.L.R. James, at the Battle of Creta-Pierrot, an important turning point in the final struggle against French forces, Marie-Jeanne Lamartiniere accompanied her husband and took her share of the defense. On the other hand, Claire Hiroux, wife of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, was sympathetic toward opposing forces and attempted to save some of the Frenchmen who were scheduled for execution. And then Sanité Belair is another woman who I mentioned earlier, who is oftentimes noted in the historical archive for her role in fighting alongside her husband, Charles Belair, and for being executed alongside him as well. So in addition to thinking about how women contributed to the revolutionary effort, it's also important to ask other questions about the ways these periods of social upheaval and transformation, like the Haitian Revolution, impacts the lives of women and children and their well-being. Jessica Johnson's work has brought attention to Black women and girls' experiences with the long Middle Passage into Louisiana, as they were displaced and victimized by both the transatlantic slave trade and later by the Natchez Revolt. So some of her work kind of prompts me to ask questions like, how did women and girls cope with the trauma, violence, and structures that commodified them, displaced them, and severed their social ties? So for many, maintaining their intimate connections and preserving those relationships, even in the face of death, was paramount to women's survival strategies. For example, one unnamed woman and her daughters were captured during the 1802 Leclerc expedition and were condemned to death. As they walked together toward their execution, their mother consoled her crying daughters, encouraging them to, quote, "rejoice, for your wombs will not beget slaves," end quote. As the mother of enslaved girls, This unnamed heroine's final declaration illustrated what must have amounted to a life lived in a state of constant grief, fear, and anger that undoubtedly arose from having little to no protection from sexual violence or control over one's destiny or that of one's children. For her, death meant freedom from her own bondage and freedom from the reproductive labor of bringing new life into a world defined by unending work, violence, and death. This anecdote reveals how the formerly enslaved women of colonial Haiti viewed the revolution as a source of liberation that would end their reality of coerced reproduction and slavery. In this case, the risk of sacrificing one's life was worth the ability to regain control over the intimacies of mothering and kinship. To cite Johnson again, she defines Black femme freedom as based on, quote, the enslaved and free African women and girls' capacity to belong to themselves and to each other, and to articulate radical opposition to bondage, reinterpreting wickedness as freedom, intimacy as fugitive, and Blackness as diasporic. So my own research has demonstrated the lengths to which enslaved and maroon women went to maintain and preserve their family connections, especially to their children. Some of you may be familiar with the Manuel Maroon community that was based in the Bauruco Mountains that set on the border of French Saint-Domingue and Spanish Santo Domingo. And a longstanding Maroon community or community of runaways had existed in those mountains pretty much since the first Africans were brought to the Americas, to the island, and who later escaped with the Taino who were remaining, and then escaped on their own to flee the Spanish Empire, the Spanish sugar plantations, and then later Maroons would continue to seek out the Bauruco Mountains as a place of refuge from the plantation economy under the French regime. And so this community was actually a part of a political project in some ways, in terms of the ways that they agitated both the French and the Spanish empires by raiding plantations and simply representing a zone of freedom that was a threat to both slave societies, right? You have this community of self-freed people in the middle of an island that has built its social and economic and political foundation upon slavery. And so the symbol of their existence represented a threat. And so in the late 18th century, these Maroons negotiated a treaty with the French and Spanish colonies for them to come to an agreement for the Manuel Maroons to have plots of land, to have their freedom formally recognized by both empires, and to be able to live freely and cultivate their own crops amongst themselves. And so in the archives, there is a roster of 100 members of the Manuel Maroon community. I don't think that there were only 100 who were in this particular, who were living in the mountains, but there are only about 140 people who were living in this particular community who came to treaty with the French and the Spanish. And in this treaty, it lists each one of the individuals who were a part of the treaty, and they're grouped together by family, by household. And so by looking at this treaty, I was able to get a sense of people's ages, their names, their first names, or how they called themselves. And the treaty also gives a general idea of where people were born. And so it's kind of a rudimentary census, if you will, that shows these different households where we see women with children, some women without children, women living with their husbands, et cetera, et cetera. And so based on analyzing this particular treaty and just taking account of the number of women who were of childbearing age and the number of children who were in this community, I was able to find that the Manuel community, this Maroon community who were living in the mountains and came to this treaty with the French, their child to woman ratio was over twice as high as the ratio between women and children on plantations among the enslaved populations. And so what this suggested to me is that this higher ratio between women and children among the Manuel Maroon community, it suggests that Maroon settlements were likely spaces where the material conditions, the overall conditions of these spaces were much more amenable to sustaining life and to nurturing kinship ties between mother and child, in comparison to the deadlier conditions and violence that was rife on plantations. And so these women in these Maroon communities essentially were having higher numbers of children. And I think that speaks to the, again, it speaks to the level of, it speaks to the conditions that they were able to cultivate within those spaces that were so drastically different than those that were found on plantations, where, again, the enslaved population was not reproducing itself because of the violence and brutality and death that enslaved people experienced. So another example of the ways that the colonial society, as well as the revolution itself, had an impact on women and girls is the story of Dede Bézil, who is sometimes known as Défilé La Folle. Dede Bézil's story is also exemplary of the emotional labor that women performed in the face of the Haitian revolutionary struggle. The psychological toll that it inflicted upon her earned her the nickname La Folle, or the Mad Woman. Though most of the details of her origins and early life are mired in obscurity, Dede Bézil is known to many as one of Haiti's founding mothers because of her great sacrifices during the revolution. Known for her support of the revolutionary troops, and for collecting the remains of Jean-Jacques Dessalines after he was assassinated in 1806. According to Haitian scholar Octave Petit, Dede Bézil also lost 3 of her sons and 2 of her brothers in the Battle of Fort Liberté. So we can see in this painting here on the right, this is a depiction of Dede Bézil, and she's carrying a bag over her shoulder that is containing the body parts of Jean-Jacques Dessalines so that he could be properly buried. So I think this image also provokes us to think about how Dede Bézil and Haitian women and Black women more broadly tend to carry the weight of their families and societies emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and economically. So more research is needed on other women like Catherine Flon, Suzanne Louverture, and Marie-Louise Christophe, wife of King Henry Christophe, along with the narratives that present the complex realities of Haitian women's place and role within histories of the Haitian Revolution and in present day society. So when we think about La Cuse, the Combi, Haitian religion, and other distinctly Haitian and social and cultural formations, women are central within those spaces. However, women often are relegated to performing agricultural work to economically uphold the nation. And so these gender dynamics have led to kind of masculinist, militaristic interpretations of Haiti's political history that sometimes devalues women and their work and their societal contributions to the making of the modern nation of Haiti. So these narratives need to be problematized and to recenter Haitian women as the potomitan, not just as the pillar of their families and communities, but also as pillars of the economy and in collective efforts for transformational social change in Haitian society. So that's all I have for right now, but I'm glad to take any of your questions as we close out this evening. Thank you again for being here, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edens, Crystal. And at this time, we really we really thank you for this comprehensive and really eye-opening, really gathering of all those facts about our Asian women. And at this point, we would love to have the audience ask some question. I have one who is coming to mind, but I would like to give Dr. St. Paul the first stab at a question or a comment or an answer. So Dr. St. Paul, please go ahead and let us know what you want to
Okay,
know.
good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, very clearly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Eden, for this wonderful and inspiring lecture. So I have a specific question for you. Now, as you might know, there is an ongoing debate in the humanities and social sciences about decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing social sciences. So, but the social sciences are, according to your own research, actually were built or have been built upon masculine domination. Masculine domination history in Western modernity, history in Western modernity has been historically written by men and for men. So how do you see, for instance, what we should do in order to reverse that masculine domination when it comes also to reflect on the historical contribution of women as the pillar of the Haitian society? Because discursively, rhetorically, we say women are the potomitan, are the pillar of the Haitian society. But in practice, we do not give to Haitian women the place they deserve in history, the place they deserve in society. How to do that, to advance toward the decolonization, at the same time to reverse masculine domination within the interdisciplinary and intersectional field of Haitian studies, for instance. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you for that question, Dr. St. Paul. That's such an amazing question, and it's one that I've been kind of struggling with over time. And I think that if I, had to go back and, rewrite my book over again, I probably would have done so many things differently. And part of that would probably start with trying to understand the spaces that women occupy, and maybe in a sense to work backwards in terms of establishing a connection to, the antecedents of those spaces and behaviors and roles. I think about Haitian market women, for example, and the prominence that they have in those economic spaces, and can only imagine how much that represents their historical significance and is a representation of that. And so part of what I've tried to do is to think through and think with scholars who have been doing the kind of at the cutting edge of thinking about how to decolonize the social sciences and humanities. People like Jean Casimir, Sylvia Winter, Mimi Scheller, Jessica Johnson, just a number of scholars who are looking at sources and really trying to subvert them in a sense. And so I think part of what has to happen is that, yes, we collect the sources that are there, but we have to read through them or even read across or beneath them in order to gain a better understanding of what was actually happening. And that's something that I tried to do with the runaway advertisements. You know, we know that these were sources that plantation owners used to try to track down runaways, to try to re-enslave runaways. But I tried to use them as an opportunity to try to understand runaways and to try to center what is written as in terms of how it expressed individual Maroons, their intentionality, their thought processes, their actions and behaviors geared toward something other than being, you know, re-enslaved. And so I think that, again, subverting those archival sources, but then also, again, leaning into non-archival sources. And so in my book, I also try to incorporate aspects of Haitian music or excerpts from songs that help to not necessarily center women per se, but help to explicate some of those historical realities that are not written in a 18th century document, right? So using, like you said, these interdisciplinary methods, such as relying on music, oral histories, and again, thinking with scholars who have been doing this work for a very long time and are very deeply embedded in the contemporary and historical realities. Somebody like Rochelle Beauvoir-Dominique is another scholar whose work I rely on quite a bit. And so I think it takes a combination of things to try to unveil and reverse the ways that our literature not only has been colonized, but also has been gendered. But thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Dance. Now we have Dr. Pierre Natalie. So she has a question,
Hello.
so go ahead.
Thank you so much. Dr. Edens, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Your analysis of the women to child ratio on the Manuel Maroon community was absolutely brilliant. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. And I also appreciate your reframing of défilé, because you've brought in our contemporary understanding of mental health issues by both identifying défilé as one of the founding mothers of the Haitian nation, but the emotional labor also caused some mental harm. And it's very interesting putting the Haitian Revolution in direct conversation with the psychological impact of a revolution. So thank you for teasing that out. So my specific question is, what else can you share with us about the lives of revolutionary Haitian women from account books or other archives where women are traditionally thought to be erased? Thank you so much.
Hi, Natalie. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for your question and for your comment. I think I do feel that the conversations around the ways that women and children are affected by upheaval or just social unrest in general is something that I was kind of challenged to try to reframe, because and this, I think, again, kind of speaks back to Dr. St. Paul's question. Oftentimes, I know at least I was initially just tempted to want to find out, well, what did the women do? What were they doing? Were they, who had the guns? You know what I mean? Who was shooting? Who was on the front lines? And I think oftentimes we have to kind of put that into different perspective in terms of what warfare represents and the ways that it has an impact on those in its society. And so thank you for bringing that up. In terms of other things that can be shared in the archive, this is a really difficult question that I hopefully have not yet explored fully. But I believe there is another scholar who has a website called Femme Rebelle. And she has been doing, and I think you're probably acquainted with her, and has been doing archival work around Marie-Louise Christophe, and I believe Suzanne Louverture, and tracing their journeys in France and I believe in Italy. And so there's, from what I understand, probably a significant or an important amount of information in those archives. And I would imagine as well that there's probably existence of women in the Spanish archives as well. Again, unfortunately for this book project, I wasn't able to track down those individual women outside of some of the women that I just mentioned. But I believe that there's a great deal left to be done. But as far as the, just general archives where we think that women are, or where we tend to assume that women are disappeared, is in, I believe, in the maroon advertisements, in the fugitive advertisements. And that's the body of records that I mostly have dealt with for my book that I've been working on. So generally, I think that scholars often tend to assume that that women were typically petite maroons or short-term maroons who escaped temporarily and then would frequently return. And I definitely see evidence of that. But there are also women in these fugitive advertisements who were at large or had escaped for months and sometimes years at a time. And many of them were using their social networks, their families, free people of color, and sometimes other maroons to facilitate or to help them find a place of refuge. And so, again, I think focusing on the areas where women are more dominant, so to speak, such as family, kind of helps to unveil some of those histories. And so part of the reason why I started to look at the maroons was because there were so many women represented in those advertisements, whereas in some of the other archives, it might be a little bit, it might take a little more effort to track them down. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. I have now. I want to acknowledge one hand, that is up, and it is probably Cozy. So you have the floor, Cozy, and after that, I will go ahead and take some of the questions. We have some questions in the chat, and I will post them to you, Cadence. Okay. So
I would have liked to learn so much more about Charlotte Papillon, because this is, to be honest, it's the first time I'm hearing of her. Is there a project or an idea somewhere, somehow, to kind of create some kind of repository, right? A central repository where we can, where information about these women can be collected and shared with the public at large in a much easier way than what's going on right now. Because I mean, even when you search for her, you can barely find anything. I mean, is there, I'm grateful to see two Haitian women historians on this call. So, since you're in that circle, is there a project or an idea to do that?
I'm still toying around with the idea, with what I want to, or how I want to try to incorporate or fully center women in, maybe in my next project. I have an article out now in Gender and History that looks at the Manuel Maroon community and outlines their fertility, as well as looks at other women Maroons. But as far as Charlotte Papillon, I wish I could recall exactly what brought her to my attention. But I believe I would be willing to bet that there's probably information about her in Spanish records, because there's another scholar, I believe, named Miriam Franchina, who is doing work on Jean-Francois Papillon after he leaves Haiti and goes to Spain. And I believe his family traveled with him, as well as the families of his soldiers. And so I would bet that there's something about her, or more information about her and the other women in those records. Unfortunately, you know, I don't speak Spanish just yet, and so I haven't been able to look at those records, and haven't been able to figure out how to kind of collectivize that information. But I do know that the advertisement for Charlotte Papillon is in the Marinage in the Le Monde, the Atlantique. It's in the database that was started by the French Atlantic History Group. I can put the link to the database in the chat, but these advertisements from Les Affiches Américaines, as well as ads from other French Caribbean and French North American colonies, are all in this one particular database. So that's one place where they are housed, where the advertisements are housed. But as far as a hub for information about women and the Haitian Revolution more generally, again, there's another website that I can put in the link as well, Femme Rebelle. But those are the two things that I can think of off the top of my head.
It would be great if you share them. At least, you know, we have a starting point, you
Okay.
know?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you so much. Actually, I would really welcome the audience now, you know, to put some questions. I have like some questions. I have 2 questions from Dr. Duquesne, and I'm gonna give them to you. One is pretty much a question that is asking, is Princess Amethyst the daughter of King Henry? So that's one question. So I don't know if you have an answer to that.
You know what? I thought that at one point, because he had a daughter named Amethyst, and the other daughter's name was Athenaire, I believe. But when I looked at later biographies of Christophe, it seemed that his daughters were born after the revolution, and that Christophe himself, I don't think, he would not have been old enough to have a daughter that was a part of the revolution uprising, who was like a young girl in 1791. So I would have loved for that to have been true, but it didn't seem like the timelines added up. So I don't think that's the case. But it seems like maybe there may have been some confusion about that because the Christophs brought in some of the women soldiers from Dahomey, some of the Amazons. And so I wonder if some of the letter writers or the people who were writing about Christophe at the time were imagining him as having this daughter who was a quote unquote Amazon, and that he was and that this young woman was a part of the uprising. But again, I don't think that the timeline adds up, but that's just my take on it.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, Dr. Duquesne, I have another question. He would like to know if you have come across any archival records of Tante Toya, who, according to oral traditions, raised and trained Dessalines in the art of war.
Right. No, I haven't seen anything related to that. I understand that that oral tradition speaks to the presence of this woman. Based on my understanding of the, as I understand the oral tradition, that she was a woman who was one of the Dahomean Amazons who was enslaved and traded in the slave trade. Generally, I think Africanist historians would say that the Amazons were not sold as slaves. But to me, I think that it's definitely possible, because many of them came from lower status or were enslaved in Dahomean society, and many captives of war, especially in Dahomey, were sold, especially during those periods of fighting with the Oyo Empire. John Thornton talks about this, so I definitely think that it is plausible that that one of those women soldiers was captured and was participating in war, was captured in war, and was sold as a war captive, and then later shows up in Haiti. Again, I haven't seen or haven't heard of any archival document that speaks to that, but I certainly think that it's plausible and possible.
Thank you. And there is a question from Karen Dulles. And actually, this is a question that probably a lot of us are pausing, asking too. What will it take for the children of Haiti to learn about this history in schools or in America, for the children, for the children of Asian descent, or in America, or American children in general? Like, what will it take for the children to learn about this history? Because this is so rich.
Wow, yeah, I don't know. That's the $1,000,000 question, I think. I mean, especially in the climate that we're in right now, where there's such an attack on critical race theory, or what some people think critical race theory is. There's these, attacks on African American history, and just the overall resistance to any type of history or any type of education that is going to counter the narratives that we've all kind of been indoctrinated with, that support colonialism, that support slavery. And as far as how, how Haitian education needs to be transformed, I don't know that I'm really, the person to be able to answer that, especially as, someone who is born and raised and rooted in the North American context. But what I do feel that, part of what I want to be able to contribute is to be able to share as much, information as I can with Haitian communities, with African American communities, so that we can take these resources back to our communities and educate the youth and help them have something to better understand themselves and the world that they're living in.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And this question really is open to anybody in the audience who would have something that they can give us as part of the contribution to what can be done. I see there are so many people that are very really grateful for your presentation, Dr. Edens, and I want to share that, hey, the chat is booming with those. But I have one comment that I think Dr. Dutes again put. Other historians have reported that the women were often more verbal than the men in articulating their grievance than the men. Any comment on that?
Well, I think the evidence from the southern Haiti region, talking about the women cultivators and their grievances, in some ways may speak to that, especially because not only were they dissatisfied with their working conditions, they were also dissatisfied with the pay that they were receiving. So if we, think about it in contemporary terms, in terms of intersectionality, not only were they experiencing class exploitation, they were experiencing gender oppression as well. And so if anyone wants to read more about that, I believe Philippe Girard has an article about talking about some of these women who were protesting the labor conditions in southern Haiti.
Thank you. And actually there is another comment and also a question embedded in it from another participant, Lynn. She thanked you for this incredible talk. but she is looking forward to reading your book later this fall. She learned about your presentation from a Haitian archaeologist, Mupana, whose doctoral dissertation research is in the Maroon settlement near Marchand des Salines. And she wants to know, can you tell us a little bit about how your work in the archives and analysis of cultural production, like music and perhaps oral histories that engages material culture? And she wants also to know, are there contemporary forms of communitarism, I'm sorry, communitarism and spirituality that you examine to shed light on Haitian women's role in freedom movement?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So one of the chapters of the book talks about, looks at ritual communities in colonial Haiti, and particularly focuses on the development or how the Petro came into existence, for example, or how the Kalenda came into formation, and the ways that participants used these religious and ritual spaces as and politicized them and infused them with political meaning. So I look at things like Macandal and some of the women who were operating and in concert with Macandal to distribute these amulets or ritual packets that enslaved people oftentimes used to protect themselves spiritually, to protect themselves from harm, or to attract positive fortune, or to attract good luck. And so I talk about these things in that chapter, and the ways that women were kind of central in distributing these material artifacts, these aspects of material culture, and the importance that in the ways that we might be able to connect women like Bridget Macandal or Marie Catherine Kingay, and how they exemplify women's power spiritually, as well as the ways that spiritual power kind of translated into a political power, or a power amongst the community in terms of being an authority figure.
Okay. Thank you. And there is another question from Kevin Lewis, and he wants to know, what do you think about the document from Tariq Nahid, Haiti, 1804? I don't know if this is something you're familiar with.
I'll be frank, like Tariq Nasheed is not my favorite human being, but I think that the documentary that he put together, I don't recall seeing anything in it that I disagreed with, but then again, I'm not the end all be all of Haitian revolutionary studies. So, I won't, I didn't have any real critique of it. I had my critiques of the individual in terms of, his attitudes about women and race and things like that. But that wasn't a part of the documentary, so I'll just leave that alone. Sorry.
All right, I hope, Kevin, you have your answer. So if you have more questions, we will entertain them. And I think, Dr. Dutes is giving us another comment that I would like to really bring to your attention. He said, this is an excellent presentation. It brings women to the center as opposed to the periphery of the struggle, and contributes to an understanding of the role of procreation in resisting and undermining slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Bravo. And thank you, Professor Edens.
Thank you.
This was something that you said, and I would like to just put a little comment on when you were making the difference, when you were actually establishing the difference between the Maroons women and the way they had more children. That captured my attention in the way for the women who worked on the plantation were a little bit more resistant. It's like almost a resistance to give, to give birth. So for me, I'm looking at this as not only the fact that, you know, the emotional ties that, you know, and the way those women were responding, not only resisting, but also I feel like probably the giving birth in an environment where they know their children had a chance to be free, in a way where like, you know, and maybe they were like, you know, more inclined to have children with people that they knew they love and they knew that they were not going to be put into slavery. So I really, that really captured my attention. I said, hey, freedom
Mhm.
to bring children. All right. Is there any other question? I know one thing that I wanted to bring to the attention of our audience. Dr. Edens had put like, you know, the link when Cozy had asked, and, you know, so make sure that you can actually download them. If you go to the chat, you can find those the links for, you know, to find more about the women maroons. And I don't know if that answers, don't know, that will give Cozy what she needs about Mrs. Charlotte Papillon, but definitely those links are there for you to explore.
Gillian, I'm also putting them on LCS Facebook page so that everybody can have access to them there.
All right, thank you so much, Cozy, for that. I'm sure that, you know, many of us will be exploring them later. So wonderful. Do we have any other questions? I think, you know, it's good for us to take this opportunity when we have one of our historian here, like, you know, giving it to us to really entertain. And yeah, Dr. Mora, go ahead, man.
I want to thank Dr. Eden for confirming that women were the part of the fabric in the beginning of the nation. And I think it's also very inspiring. And I understood that we hope that some of the women in Haiti and in the diaspora of Haitian descent, we could see that they were the fabrics then. We can be the fabrics now to change our country.
I like that. I like that. I was gonna actually ask a question, but I didn't want to put Dr. Edens on the you know, right
Well,
there.
I don't think it's Dr. Edens right there. It's for us.
It's for all of us. It's like, you know, okay,
Right.
what do you think we should, like, you know, or do you think, like, you know, we having the same impact, or is there something more that we can do as Haitian women, as women of Haitian descent, to do more to claim the freedom of our country right now?
Right. We are enslaved now.
Yeah, we are like so much is being said about us, about, like, you know, our country. We see our country struggling, and, you know, we know a lot of women are actually working hard, but is there something we need to do, and as, you know, harder? And there is something that Dr. Dutas put as a question. I wanted to go there. He said he understand that the work of some historian that 50% of Toussaint's army recruits at some points were women.
Mm.
And he said, do you have any thought?
I haven't seen that specific statistic, though I think in Laurent Dubois' book, he does talk a little bit about Toussaint's reaction to women. And I believe even later in 1801, under his constitution, there were provisions in there that in some ways constrained women's movement and their participation in religious activities. And I kind of perceive that as a form of repression of mass mobilization against the labor regime that was starting to resemble slavery toward the beginning of the 19th century. And so that doesn't necessarily answer the question about the 50%. I certainly would love to find out more in terms of hoping to find that archival evidence. I haven't seen it, but I again can only imagine that with women constituting such a high percentage of the enslaved population at the end of the century, and then with the ways that we know women perform these different roles in society, I don't think that it's impossible. I think it's probably likely.
All right. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, go for it. Thank you.
So, given that today is 18 May, right, and we're talking about Haitian women and so forth and so on, and Dr. Marie Morel, she made the comment about, how women were, at the center with a pillar, right? And so, given the context that we have in Haiti today, do we, in your opinion, need a revolution? And if we were to perhaps have the women run that revolution, would we be successful?
Very interesting.
You want to answer, Christian? You want to answer that, guidance? Go ahead.
I agree. I can try. I mean, I think that I think it's for, the people of Haiti to decide, if and when there is going to be a revolution. But I think that as a woman, and thinking about the ways that society marginalizes women, I think that any revolution with women at the center is bound to transform society in ways that are perhaps deeper than the types of revolutions that sometimes replicate the kind of oppressive or militaristic structures that were already existing. And so I would hope or would want to believe that any women-centered revolution would be a complete revolution, in the sense that women's humanity is I think that when women's humanity is recognized, that all people's humanity would be recognized.
Okay.
I'd like to make a statement. I think I'm Jocelyn. I think it's time that maybe we initiate some programs to encourage men to acknowledge or bring about their daughters, their moms, their spouses. I don't know if it's women that would maybe open such a forum, but as that happens, I think there'll be more, we could see more inclusion of women in being welcome and recognized in society. I think education would be at the base, but I'm not sure if it would be women to initiate it or men at this point. I don't know. Anybody has any idea?
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you. I think, this is really an interesting perspective that you're bringing here. Will it be the woman or will it be the men? But, we got to remember that, in our Haitian culture, we have a male dominant culture anyway. So it's like a lot of effort. But I think, it needs to be, I will answer essentially to you. It needs to start with us as women, because not only we are the mothers, we are the wife, and we are the daughters. So if somebody needs to shake the men, it's going to be us. Okay. So for all the men there, pardon me, but, I'm a little bit very passionate about when it comes to bringing down a little bit of that dominance. So, Dr. St. Paul, we're going to give you one, chance. I see your hand up, and I have a couple of questions that we have still for Dr. Edens on the. Go ahead. You can unmute yourself, please.
Okay. Yes. My next question. I was talking to a veteran in the army, and he told me that one of the most important battle for the independence of America was the Battle of Brooklyn. And in that Battle of Brooklyn, according to this veteran of the army, Charles Belair and Sonny Belair both participated in the Battle of Brooklyn. I wonder if your archival sources reveal anything about that participation of Sanin Belair in the Battle of Brooklyn. Thank you.
Thank you. I am not familiar with this, but I actually just recently learned about a book that has been written about Sanité Belair, and I can put the title in the chat if you'd like. It's called Martyred Lieutenant Sanité Belair, Haiti's Revolutionary Heroine by Philip Thomas Tucker. I imagine that that might have a little bit more information, but again, going back to CLR James, it does, from some of his writings, it does appear that she was very much in concert with her husband, Charles Belair, in terms of participating in these different battles.
All right. Thank you. So I have, there is only one, I know that Lynn had a question, but I have, Dr. Dutes had a question about mentioning the women. When you mentioned the women roles as spiritual nurturers and guide, would you elaborate more? Was it through religion?
Yes, and I think of Haiti's African-based tradition of Haitian Voodoo as having a subversive quality, especially during the colonial period, because plantation owners, slave owners, they did not want to see enslaved people develop any type of structure or hierarchy that was internal to the enslaved community or the enslaved population, because any type of leadership would represent a direct threat to the plantation, a direct threat to the slave owner and the foundations of slavery. But one of the things that I argue, and that I think other scholars like Sylvia Winter would argue, is that it was in these religious spaces that not only were people able to connect with their spiritual identities, with the spirits that they revered, but they were also able to communicate with one another without the surveillance, without the immediate surveillance of white plantation owners. And so if they're going to funerals, if enslaved people's funerals, or going to churches at night, or into the woods to have different ritual practices or ceremonies, those were spaces that allowed for, like I said, connection to spirit and connection to culture, but then also to plan and organize and strategize about how to resist the system. And so I think women, as we know, are very prominent in those religious spaces contemporarily and historically. I think one of the queen mothers from Dahomey, Hoanjil, I believe she's also considered a Loa, but this particular queen mother was responsible for introducing new spirits into the pantheon. And so there was, women were very much instrumental in connecting to the spirit world, as well as connecting enslaved people from different backgrounds and bringing them together to organize.
Thank you, Dr. Edens. Actually, we, believe it or not, time flies when we're having fun, but there is actually, we will entertain the last question for you. And so, Dr. Dutes would like to know, would like to acknowledge that the leaders of the revolution all had very strong women to whom they were devoted. Any thought about the dynamics of those relationships as reflected in archival records?
Right, I think that, so part of the issue of how women have been kind of erased in the archival records, and please, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is, with French, the way that that plural pronouns are are stated when there's a mixture of men and women in one space is that the plural pronoun defaults to the male. Right? It defaults to the male, to the masculine. And I mean, if there's a group of women, then the plural pronoun goes to the, to describe them goes to the feminine. But when there's a mixture of women and men, it defaults to the masculine. And so I think that even just in the writing of the way French is constructed, it kind of conceals the presence of the feminine. So, you know, the question about the 50%, that may be an area where we just don't necessarily know because of the way that the archives are written. But I do think that when it comes to partnership, when it comes to being wives and the women who were accompanying these military officers, I think that it's a good thing that we are able to know these women's names and to try to be able to piece together their stories. But I also am. It's also frustrating that we only know them because of who their husbands were, right? We only know them because they're immediately attached to a man who was also, you know, who was a part of this process. And so I think that kind of, in a way, unfortunately, kind of goes back to the ways that history and even language prioritizes the masculine and hides the feminine, hides the presence of women, with the exception of those who are attached or otherwise partnered. And so I think there's a kind of a double-edged sword there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edens. At this time, we would love to know if you had any final thought. I know there were, like, you know, there are other couple of questions that, you know, we're not leaving unanswered, believe it or not, but, you know, we know time is running away from us. But as far as there is a question about why is voodoo looked down upon these days, so this is a question that we will probably looking forward to address in another session when we have time, because that probably will take more than a debate from us. So Dr. Eden, do you have any final thought, please?
Final thoughts. I do see a question about midwifery and spirituality, and long story short, I'll say yes. There is a woman midwife that I write about in the book named Marie Catherine Kinge. She was a midwife. She was a Vodou queen. She was a healer, and in many ways, those things made her visible in the records, but also made her a woman who was considered to be a threat to the colonial order. So I definitely think that there's a connection between midwifery, spirituality, and political power in that context. But I think just to close, I just want to thank you all again for inviting me. Thank you for these very thoughtful and engaging and challenging questions. And I appreciate all of your feedback, and I look forward to further conversations. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Eden, so much for your wonderful presentation. And, you know, for those of us, you know, there was a question about does the Louverture Cultural Society have a tie with any organization in Haiti? We have to just to tell you, listener, definitely we are a very new organization. We were just, you know, we are short of a year old. We're only a year old, and we are taking pleasure on really exposing the Haitian culture and, you know, everything that is Haiti. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Until next time.
Great job. Good job.
Hi, thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Dr. Eden.